Hi, we're about to go through the third and fourth subheadings of the third subheading of Chapter 34. We're going to be talking about the Paris Peace Conference and the loss of European preeminence. So, after any war, there's usually a series of different things that happen, a series of different treaties, and so on and so forth, and conferences. The one we usually focus on is the Paris Peace Conference when we're talking about World War One. It is dominated by France, Great Britain, and the United States. And even though the World War One is going to end by a bureaucratic whimper instead of like a overpowering military victory, Great Britain and France especially are going to act like it. So at the Paris Peace Conference, there isn't Central Powers representation. There's a dictated peace that basically the Central Powers have to take on, which has a whole bunch of issues. One of the driving forces here is going to be President Wilson of the United States, who's going to come up with these 14 points, which are really going to be popular with a lot of groups around the world. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of freedom happening here: the sea, economic borders, a lot of self-determination by a lot of different areas, and a League of Nations, which we'll talk about later. But the overriding thing you really need to understand is that the peace treaties were very harsh towards the Central Powers. There's going to be reparations, which we'll talk about next chapter, and a lot of other things which is going to kind of feed is going to be used to kind of galvanize what's going to end up being World War II. So if you take a look at the territorial changes, there's three empires. We talked about the Russian Empire collapsing in the first one of the series. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire, as you can see, collapses. And we'll talk about the Ottomans in just a second. But take a look at Russia here. Now, normally, Russia would have been able to get back Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. They would have been able to do that, but they limped out of the war. So that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk basically enables these countries to have self-determination, to create their own countries, which they very happily do so. But the other ones that we need to talk about is the Ottoman Empire. So the Treaty of Sèvres is going to be a huge blow to the Ottoman Empire. It's going to remove the Balkans, Arab provinces. It's going to allow for Europeans to have some occupation in Anatolia. Eventually, the great leader for this area is going to end up being Ataturk, who is going to lead an uprising against the Sultanate, against the Greeks as well, even though your book doesn't talk about that, and is going to eventually found the Republic of Turkey and be their president. The Allies eventually are going to recognize that sovereignty in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. Some of the important things to talk about is that it's an intensely secular government, so it's kind of in the tradition of the Young Turks, and we're going to have, it's going to help give women more rights than they had before. As you can see, we're really kind of broken up, and so Turkey is what is left essentially of the Ottoman Empire, and these are mandates, which I'll talk about in just a second. All right, so that other thing I mentioned before is the League of Nations. So the League of Nations is going to be created by diplomats in Paris, and the idea is that if there is a place where countries can sort out their grievances, then we're not going to have a huge world war again. So we have 42 member states sign up initially, including 26 non-European ones. Interestingly, even though it was Wilson's idea, the United States does not sign on because they don't want to be roped into what's happening in Europe. Although Wilson's idea of self-determination, a group of people being able to rule themselves, is a huge part of it. Also, what do we do about colonies? Well, what we're going to have is we're going to start to have a mandate system created, which is basically going to control formerly colonized areas that Europeans claim can't control themselves, including like Palestine, Syria, so on and so forth. The last thing we need to talk about is the challenges to European preeminence. And although Europe is still has the most powerful countries in the world, they are going to have a diminished economic stature. High debts, inflation, they're going to lose control of some of their investments, foreign markets. And the U.S. is going to switch from being a debtor to a major creditor at this point, and we'll talk much more about that in the next chapter. But beyond money, there's just a loss of prestige. This idea of the Europeans being so much more superior than everybody else, or being invulnerable, is going to leak out in this very horrible war. The idea of self-determination is going to get very popular amongst former colonies and other subjugated people. And it's going to have two very interesting proponents for it. On one hand, you're going to have Wilson's 14 points, which is going to be big for it. And the other one is actually from the communists, who Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who are very anti-imperialistic. And so these two different ends of the political spectrum are actually going to inspire people around the world to try to rise up